She looked like someone's grandmother. White hair, round glasses, floral blouses. She offered warm meals, clean beds, and a sense of family to those who had none. But beneath the porch and flower beds, something else was rotting. Over several years, people came to her for shelter. Many never left. This is the story of Dorothea Puente and the bodies buried in her backyard. Sacramento, California. 1988. Nestled just east of downtown lies a quiet, unassuming street, F Street. Large shade trees stand like sentries along the sidewalk. It's a neighborhood of time-worn homes, faded paint, and families that wave when they pass. And in the center of it all sits the Victorian boarding house at 1426 F Street. From the outside, the house is ordinary. Peeling cream-colored paint, ornamental iron fencing, curtains pulled just tightly enough to keep the world out. If you walked by it 100 times, you'd never notice it. But behind those lace curtains lived a woman whose secrets would stain that home forever. Her name was Dorothea Puente, a small woman in her late 50s, always dressed conservatively. Floral prints, vintage sweaters, sensible shoes. Her silver hair was neatly curled. Her glasses gave her a grandmotherly charm. To her neighbors, she was sweet, church-going, generous, always ready to lend a helping hand or a warm plate of food. But what no one realized was that many of the people she fed would soon vanish without a trace. She ran a boarding house, not for tourists, but for the forgotten, the disabled, the elderly, the mentally ill. Social services often placed people here when no one else would take them. Many had no family, no visitors, no voice, and that's what made them perfect. They arrived with nothing but a small check from the government and a suitcase of worn clothes. In exchange for their monthly social security, Dorothea offered them a bed, a warm meal, a safe place to stay, or so it seemed. Alvaro Bert Montoya was one of those residents. He was developmentally disabled but high-functioning and had a close connection with his social worker, Judy Moyes. Bert often called Judy to talk, but one day he stopped calling. No goodbye, no warning. When Judy asked Dorothea where Bert had gone, she was told he left to visit family. But Bert had no family. Judy pressed further. Dorothea's answers became colder, vaguer. She claimed Bert had simply moved on. But the details were fuzzy, her demeanor too smooth. Judy filed a missing persons report. She knew something wasn't right. 2 detectives were sent to the house. They knocked on the door and were greeted by the sweet old woman with a calm voice and a tray of cookies. She let them in, offered them coffee, gave them a tour of the house. But when they asked about Bert, she grew vague again, said he left weeks ago. As they walked the property, something in the backyard caught their attention. The soil was uneven, piled in strange mounds, freshly turned, despite it being late fall. When asked, Dorothea explained it was from tree work. Said a gardener had dug up some roots, but there were no tools, no fresh plantings, and the smell was off. The detectives asked for permission to dig. Surprisingly, she agreed. With a smile, shovels struck dirt. Hours passed. Then, a human leg, wrapped in cloth, shallow, decayed. They called for backup. As night fell, lights flooded the yard. Yellow tape was pulled across the gate. The quiet house at 1426 F Street was now a full-blown crime scene. Dorothea Puente watched from her doorway. It would not be the only body they uncovered. In fact, it wouldn't even be close. The officers came to check on a missing man. They expected awkward questions, maybe a heated conversation. They did not expect bones. When the first body surfaced, they assumed it was isolated, a tragic accident, an overlooked death. But Dorothea Puente's backyard had a story to tell, and it wasn't done speaking. Each day, the excavation deepened, and with every scoop of dirt removed, another horror emerged. One corpse, then another, then a third. 7 bodies would eventually be unearthed from the garden of 1426 F Street, each one hidden shallowly, as though buried in haste. Some were wrapped in cloth, some in tarps, some curled up unnaturally, like they'd been discarded, not laid to rest. Detectives quickly recognized a pattern. The victims were elderly, vulnerable, isolated. Each had one thing in common: monthly Social Security checks, collected by Dorothea herself. She had forged signatures, deposited the funds, and continued to cash checks, even as the bodies decayed beneath the flower beds. Yet, throughout the mounting horror, Dorothea Puente remained remarkably composed, cooperative, even helpful, serving tea to officers as they stepped over grave sites. She denied everything, claimed ignorance, said her boarders had simply moved out, disappeared, run off. The officers knew better, but legally, she hadn't been charged yet. Then she made a request. Innocent on the surface, dangerous in hindsight. She asked if she could leave the house briefly, to get coffee from the motel restaurant around the corner. The investigators, perhaps underestimating her cunning, agreed, under the condition she return promptly. Dorothea Puente walked out the front door of her own crime scene and vanished. The moment she disappeared, the investigation escalated from a horrifying discovery to a statewide manhunt. Across California, her face flooded television screens. Her story blanketed newspapers. Reporters dubbed her the Death House Landlady. She had become a living ghost, an elderly woman on the run, suspected of killing the very people she claimed to care for. What puzzled many was how she remained so calm, so convincing. Beneath the surface of a gentle caregiver lived a calculated predator. She knew how to pick her victims, the forgotten, the discarded, people who wouldn't be missed. And it had worked for years. While authorities hunted her across cities, other investigators began unraveling her past and found a disturbing trail of deception that stretched back decades. This wasn't a one-time act of desperation. It was a methodical pattern, a way of life, a business built on death. And as they dug deeper, both into her backyard and into her past, they would discover just how far Dorothea Puente was willing to go to keep her secrets buried. To understand how Dorothea Puente got away with murder, we have to go back, long before F Street, long before the backyard graves, because her story didn't begin with a shovel in the dirt. It began with a lie. Born in 1929 in Redlands, California, Dorothea Helen Gray had a childhood steeped in instability. Her father died young. Her mother, an alcoholic, passed shortly after. By age 10, she was orphaned and placed in an abusive foster care system that left scars deeper than anyone could see. But instead of being crushed by the system, she learned how to manipulate it. In her early adult life, she floated from identity to identity, using different names, different birth dates. She was a chameleon with forged papers and carefully crafted charm. She married multiple times. Each relationship ended in abandonment, divorce, or a mysterious death. By the 1960s, she had already been convicted, not of murder, but of fraud. She was caught forging checks, posing as a nurse, lying to welfare officers. She served time, but only short sentences. She was always well-behaved, always charming, always old lady sweet, and always planning her next move. By the late 70s, she opened her first boarding house in Sacramento. It was supposed to be a safe haven for the elderly and mentally disabled. Instead, it became a trap. Her first known victim during this period was Ruth Monroe, a woman who moved in shortly after the house opened. Within weeks, Ruth was dead. The cause? An overdose of codeine and acetaminophen. Dorothea told police Ruth had been depressed. They believed her. No charges were filed, but the truth was, Ruth had no history of depression, no previous health issues, and her family never believed the story. Then came Malcolm Mackenzie, an elderly man who accused Dorothea of drugging and robbing him. This time, the law caught up. She was convicted in 1982 and sentenced to 5 years. While in prison, she befriended her future pen pal and fiancé, Everson Gilmouth, a retiree who believed he was about to start a life with a kind, misunderstood woman. He sent her money, wrote letters, even bought her a trailer home. When she was released in 1985, he disappeared. 3 years later, his body would be found in a wooden box, floating in a river near Marysville, California, wrapped in sheets, duct-taped, decomposed beyond recognition. She had murdered him shortly after release, the same year she moved into 1426 F Street. By then, Dorothea Puente had perfected her method. She knew how to spot the forgotten, the ones who slipped through cracks. She offered them kindness, and then took everything from them, including their lives. Her past wasn't just dark. It was a blueprint. The detectives now realized this wasn't a sudden crime of opportunity. It was an operation, systematic, rehearsed. She buried them in the yard like they were garbage. But in her mind, they were assets. But Dorothea wasn't gone forever, and the final act of this investigation was about to begin. When Dorothea Puente stepped out the front door of 1426 F Street on November 11th, 1988, she didn't run. She didn't panic. She simply walked. Walked away from a backyard full of bodies, from detectives still digging, from questions that were seconds from cornering her. In that moment, she became a ghost. Puente boarded a Greyhound bus bound for Los Angeles. She sat quietly, observant. Just another elderly woman among travelers heading home or away from something. She carried no weapons, no disguise, just a red coat, a purse, and the unshakable calm of someone who had done this before. Back in Sacramento, panic slowly replaced disbelief. Detectives realized their suspect, now tied to at least 7 bodies, had been let go with a smile and a polite request for coffee. What followed was an urgent manhunt. Her face was faxed to every law enforcement agency in California. Teletype bulletins spread across state lines. Newsrooms lit up. The landlady who brought officers tea while they dug up her victims was now a fugitive. But while investigators chased her name, Dorothea chased her old patterns. She checked into a rundown motel in downtown Los Angeles, the kind of place built to forget names. She introduced herself as Donna Johansson, a retiree from out of town. The staff didn't ask questions. No ID required, no background check, just cash and quiet. Inside the building, she began weaving her story again. She struck up conversation with a pensioner named Charles Wilgus, told him she'd help with groceries, said she'd cook for him, even offered to help cash his disability checks. To Wilgus, she seemed harmless, kind even. Her gray hair pulled neatly back, her clothes modest, her voice soft. But something gnawed at him. That night, as he flipped through the TV channels, he saw her face. A breaking news segment showed her photograph, her name, her crimes. His blood went cold. The woman down the hall was wanted for burying people alive in her backyard. Wilgus didn't wait. He locked his door, called police, and stayed awake the entire night. On the morning of November 17th, 6 days after her escape, Dorothea Puente was arrested outside the Royal Viking Motel. She wore the same red coat, carried the same purse, and as the cuffs closed around her wrists, she simply smiled. During questioning, she spoke softly, said she ran because she knew no one would believe her. And in a way, she was right. The story was too bizarre, too grotesque. A woman who looked like someone's grandmother had murdered 7, maybe more, and lived among the bodies for years. But this time, belief wasn't necessary. The evidence had already been unearthed. In Sacramento, detectives had matched fingerprints, found forged checks, and tracked every penny stolen from the victims Dorothea had promised to care for. Now, they prepared for the next stage, charging her with 9 counts of murder, and proving that kindness, in her house, was a mask for killing. The trial of Dorothea Puente began in February 1993, over 4 years after the first shovel struck the earth at 1426 F Street. 4 years of questions, 4 years of evidence, and 4 years of trying to understand how a woman who made oatmeal and handed out aspirin could have buried 7 people in her own backyard. The courtroom in Sacramento brimmed with quiet anticipation. Journalists filled the benches. Sketch artists captured her stiff posture. Jurors, ordinary citizens, braced themselves for what they would hear. Before the trial even began, the judge issued warnings. The material would be disturbing, the testimony graphic, the facts unforgettable. The prosecution began with a chilling summary. Dorothea Puente killed out of convenience. She did it quietly, methodically, and with one goal: profit. Over the next several months, they brought forward a parade of witnesses: social workers, bank tellers, forensic analysts, neighbors, even former tenants who'd survived their stay, all piecing together the routine of death Puente had designed. Each victim had a similar story. They moved into the house needing help. Puente took them in, promised meals, comfort, and care. But soon after, they'd stop contacting family, withdraw from community centers, disappear from doctor's appointments, and yet their checks kept getting cashed. The pathologist's testimony was among the most damning. Each of the exhumed bodies, 7 confirmed victims, showed high levels of Dalmane, a potent sedative. Not just enough to calm, but to kill. Some showed signs of smothering, others of shallow burial trauma. Many had their identities stripped. No wallets, no ID, just clothing, bones, dirt. The prosecution argued that Dorothea had perfected a cycle: isolate, drug, kill, bury, then cash the check. Her financial records painted the rest of the picture. Meticulous bank ledgers showing deposits in the tens of thousands over several years, and every signature forged. But the defense had a strategy too, a psychological defense built on sympathy. They called her a product of trauma, abused in childhood, abandoned as a teen, institutionalized multiple times. They said she had a savior complex, that her boarding house wasn't a death trap. It was her attempt to matter. They argued she only panicked after people died and covered up the deaths out of fear, not malice.
She's someone who deeply feared abandonment, perhaps to the point of delusion.
But even this narrative began to fall apart under cross-examination. When prosecutors asked how someone with no medical training consistently obtained prescription sedatives, the defense had no answer. When they questioned why Puente continued to cash checks for people no one had seen in years, the courtroom fell silent. And when photographs of the decomposed victims were shown, Dorothea did not flinch. Jurors were visibly shaken. One later described the testimony as like watching a horror movie in slow motion. But the villain smiled at you like a grandmother. The prosecution's closing statement cut through the arguments. She preyed on the invisible, killed the forgotten. She bet on the world not caring. And for years, she was right. After 43 days of testimony and over 3,000 exhibits, the jury was sent to deliberate. They spent over a month behind closed doors. Arguments stretched. One juror wept during recess. The weight of the evidence, the magnitude of what Puente had done, hung over them like fog. Finally, on August 26, 1993, a verdict. Dorothea Puente was found guilty of 3 murders: Alvaro Bert Montoya, Dorothy Miller, and Benjamin Fink. The jury deadlocked on 6 other counts. She was sentenced to life in prison without parole. The court was silent, as if no sentence could match what had already been done. At 64, Puente was escorted to the California Institution for Women. She walked slowly, head high, not in pride, but in certainty. She would never again touch a check, bury a tenant, or stir tea in her living room. Her house had been emptied, her garden paved, but her story, the terror she buried beneath lilac bushes, would never fade. Life in prison didn't change Dorothea Puente. She adjusted quickly to her surroundings. Routine came naturally to her. Breakfast at dawn, soft footsteps in the corridor, sewing, reading, writing. Inmates called her Grandma. Some knew her story. Others didn't care. She was soft-spoken, polite, a model prisoner. Again, wearing the mask. Even from behind bars, she kept writing letters, mostly to pen pals, to reporters, to people who reached out, morbidly curious, or looking for answers. In those pages, she denied everything, claimed she was innocent, that the bodies were planted, that her only crime was trusting the wrong people.
I never hurt anyone. I tried to help, and they turned it into this.
Yet the evidence never changed. The fingerprints, the bank records, the bones, and neither did the memories of those who had dug in that soil and found horror. For Detective John Cabrera, one of the lead investigators on the case, the images of 1426 F Street never left him. He once said, "You don't forget that smell. You don't forget what it felt like to pull someone out of the ground who never got their goodbye." Dorothea never expressed remorse. Not in court, not in interviews, not in letters. When asked about the victims, she often deflected, called them troubled, transient, difficult to care for. She spoke as if their deaths were inconveniences she had to manage, not lives she had stolen. Outside the prison walls, the house on F Street was eventually sold. Renovated. Its new owners painted the walls, replaced the windows, paved over the garden. But locals still pointed at the porch when they passed, still whispered about what had been found beneath the rose bushes. True crime documentaries and books began to cover her case. But it never reached the same infamy as Gacy, Dahmer, or Bundy. Maybe it was because her weapon wasn't a knife or a gun. It was trust, manipulation, tea and sympathy. And that felt too ordinary, too close to home. On March 27, 2011, Dorothea Puente died in her prison cell. Natural causes. She was 82 years old. No family claimed her. No funeral was held. Her ashes were scattered, not in Sacramento, but in a private location the prison never disclosed. But for those who knew the case, and for the families who never got a proper goodbye, her story didn't end there. Because her crimes weren't just murder. They were a betrayal of humanity, a perversion of care, a distortion of what it means to offer someone shelter. Her house still stands, the garden grows back, but no one ever forgets what was buried there. In the end, Dorothea Puente wasn't remembered for her charm, or her cooking, or her hospitality. She was remembered for the soil beneath her garden, for the lives lost in silence, for the kind of evil that didn't scream, but whispered through lace curtains. The case changed how Sacramento viewed its own neighborhoods. It changed how social workers documented their visits, how benefits were tracked, how vulnerable adults were cared for. And yet, the scariest part remained. Dorothea Puente didn't stand out. She blended in, she baked cookies, she helped at church. She was forgettable until she wasn't. For the families of her victims, justice was a complex word. Some never learned the full truth. Some never even recovered remains. For them, closure came not with the verdict, but with the acknowledgement that someone finally listened, that someone finally dug deep enough to uncover the truth. Dorothea Puente lived the last 18 years of her life in a cell. She died with no visitors, no obituary in the local paper, just a name on a list, and a legacy stained in silence. We often think of killers as monsters, as something outside ourselves. But this case showed us something far more unsettling, that a killer can smile, can bring soup to your door, can ask how your mother is doing. That evil doesn't always come with a shadow. Sometimes it comes with a soft voice and a place to stay. And though her story ends here, the questions she left behind still whisper through the fences of F Street. How many more could there have been? How many more caretakers hide in plain sight? And if no one had asked the right questions, how much longer would she have gone on smiling, baking, and burying?